I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com.
Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death, Psychology and Theology After Freud. So here's a quote from Ernest Becker. I've been trying to come to grips with the ideas of Freud and his interpreters and heirs with what might be the distillation of modern psychology. And now I think I have finally succeeded. One of the main things I try to do in this book is to present a summing up of psychology after Freud by tying the whole development of psychology back to the still towering Kierkegaard. I am thus arguing for a merger of psychology and mythico-religious perspective. Soren Kierkegaard, The Leap of Faith. So Ernest Becker saying he distilled 20th century psychology down to its fundamental lessons, which he says indicates that the only way a human can be happy is if we believe we're immortal heroes performing for God on the cosmic stage. And he says that realization brings us full circle back to the theologian Soren Kierkegaard, who lived from 1813 to 1841. So here we'll be discussing this idea of the leap of faith. Kierkegaard assumed that God's existence cannot be proven rationally because God, as the infinite source of reason, transcends all rational categories of thought. As the eye transcends the field of its own vision, you cannot see your own eye directly. Nevertheless, whether God exists or not, humans cannot escape despair without faith in the absurdly paradoxical belief that there is an infinite God who loves finite humans infinitely, and even became one, Jesus Christ. So Soren Kierkegaard believed, as a Christian, that God, the infinitely powerful, omnipresent being, became a finite human being, and that this infinite God loves finite humans so much he actually became a finite human. Reason cannot prove the idea of God, because God is the source of reason. Reason ultimately can't prove any single truth claim. As we'll be discussing, any attempt to prove a claim as true runs into one of three seemingly unsatisfactory avenues of explanation, as we'll be discussing in a moment with the Munchausen trilemma. One of them is the infinite regress. Every reason requires another supporting reason. The other is circular reasoning, and the final one is an assertion of self-evidence. I don't need to prove this truth, it's just self-evident, it's so obvious. So we'll be discussing the Munchausen trilemma and how it's related to Soren Kierkegaard's idea of the leap of faith in a moment, but continuing here, therefore, we must make a leap of faith in God. The leap is the decision, says Kierkegaard. I am charging the individual in question with not willing to stop the infinity of reflection. I require a resolution, and in that I am right, for only in that way can reflection be stopped. At a certain point, you've got to realize reason can't prove anything, let alone prove the existence of the infinite God. And therefore, you have to just make a leap of faith. What I'm going to be discussing soon in the next few slides is how the idea of the infinite regressive reasons for belief in God can actually help us take a leap of faith, because of the parallels between the idea of God as an infinite regress of space-time itself and the epistemological problem of the infinite regress. It's a preface to what we'll be discussing in a moment. Virtue of the absurd. Singularity equals order and absurdity. So here's another quote from Kierkegaard. To act by virtue of the absurd is to act upon faith. I cannot do otherwise because I am brought to a standstill by my powers of reflection. So again, reason continue to analyze reasons for its beliefs onto infinity. So at some point, you've got to just say, I'm going to make a resolution to believe in God and take a leap into another dimension of human existence. It's not a gradual transition, according to Kierkegaard. It's the kind of a quantum leap from one electron orbit to the next. There's no intermediary traveling. It's just you're on one level, then you just have to make a passionate resolution and move to the next level of a person who has faith in God. You have to overcome the demands of reason for some final rational explanation before you take that leap. Continuing here, the psyche equals singularity equation makes the leap into an absurd faith in an infinite God much easier because the infinitely powerful singularity is the ultimate archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, is therefore the ultimate ordering principle of the universe, as well as the archetype of absurdity itself. The singularity is the place where all laws of physics break down, but toward which they point as the omnicentric creator, sustainer, and destroyer of all space-time and its laws. Here's a quote from the artist M.C. Escher, who drew the picture you see on the left. "Only those who attempt the absurd can achieve the impossible." The archetype of the self, or the God archetype, according to Carl Jung, is the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. It's the source of all of the other archetypes. All other archetypes, they come in pairs of opposites. The self archetype is the source of them and the goal toward which they strive. You see in the picture here, from one perspective, it looks like vampire bats. From another perspective, it looks like a beautiful angel with angel's wings. The union of opposites is found in the archetypal self, and I'm equating Jung's archetypal self with the gravitational singularity. It makes sense that you need to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd in God, and similarly, according to physicists, it seems you have to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd in the gravitational singularity. It makes sense if God is a gravitational singularity. Physics of the absurd. So this is a densely packed slide, and these are all quotes from famous physicists who demonstrate that the idea of a gravitational singularity is an absurdity. I'm trying to point out the parallels between the archetypal self, or the God archetype, in whom Kierkegaard says we need to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd, and a gravitational singularity, in which, according to these physicists, if you were to believe in it, you'd have to do so by some kind of a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd. Dennis Sciama, graduate advisor for Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking at Oxford University. In 1965, Roger Penrose provided a mathematical explanation for Robert Oppenheimer's claim that a star of sufficient mass must necessarily collapse into a gravitational singularity when it burns through its nuclear fuel. Stephen Hawking asked Dennis Sciama if he could do his dissertation by reversing the time dimension of Penrose's equations to provide a model of the Big Bang, which is an inside-out black hole expanding from a singularity instead of contracting into one. So here's what Dennis Sciama said, and his words are especially pertinent to this examination of the idea of a gravitational singularity because his two students are some of the superstars of black hole physics. Dennis Sciama says, "The theory of relativity contains in itself the seeds of its own decay. This self-contradictory state of infinite density, so the whole space-time has gone pathological." So general relativity contains within itself the idea of a gravitational singularity, a self-contradictory state of infinite density, which indicates that space-time is pathological. The idea of a singularity is an absurdity to physicists, and yet the mathematical equations clearly point to it. Einstein himself despised the idea of a gravitational singularity, which are implicit in his own field equations for the field of gravity and general relativity, which Karl Schwarzschild pointed out in February of 1916, just 2 months after he provided the first exact solution to Einstein's field equations. Einstein loved that first paper, which was dated December 22nd, 1915. He helped Schwarzschild get that published. But then 2 months later, Schwarzschild put out another paper about a black hole with a central singularity. Einstein hated it. He never believed in a gravitational singularity. It's a pathological idea, according to most physicists. Michio Kaku, City College of New York, and also openly an atheist, says, "To a mathematician, infinity is simply a number without limit. To a physicist, it's a monstrosity. It means that, first of all, gravity is infinite at the center of a black hole. The time stops. And what does that mean? Space makes no sense. It means the collapse of everything we know about the physical universe. In the real world, there's no such thing as an infinity. Therefore, there is a fundamental flaw in the formulation of Einstein's theory." In a way that's similar to the way Michio Kaku said it, this television series Horizon, this episode was called "Who's Afraid of a Big Black Hole?" So Michio Kaku, what he says here, calling the idea of a singularity a monstrosity, it's so absurd, it's the collapse of everything we know about the physical universe that he thinks, therefore, the theory of general relativity must contain some flaw. Stephen Hawking wrote about Pope Pius XII, who said in 1951 that the gravitational singularity of the Big Bang seems like the creative hand of God. And that because of that statement, many physicists started to reject the idea of a gravitational singularity for theological reasons, not for scientific reasons. It seems to me that Michio Kaku probably despises the monstrous idea of a gravitational singularity for theological reasons more than for scientific reasons, because the mathematical equations clearly do point to it. And the fact that a singularity is where the laws of physics collapse doesn't mean that it's not a real thing. The point of these past few slides is that Kierkegaard says we need to take a leap of faith in God by virtue of the absurd. Similarly, we need to take a leap of faith in the gravitational singularity by virtue of the absurd, because the singularity is the point where the laws of physics totally break down and nothing makes any sense anymore. So continuing this series of quotes from physicists commenting on the absurdity of the idea of a gravitational singularity, we turn to Andrew Strominger from Harvard University. We know what a singularity is. A singularity is when we don't know what to do. The singularity is when our understanding of nature breaks down. That's what a singularity is. Finally, Max Tegmark from MIT. To me, what's so embarrassing about a singularity is that we can't predict anything about what's going to come out of it. Now, I could have a singularity here, and then boom, out comes a pink elephant with purple stripes. And that's consistent with what the laws of physics predict, because they don't predict anything. So a pink elephant with purple stripes, obviously that's the picture here. The point is that the physicist's description of the absurdity of the idea of a gravitational singularity seemed to perfectly parallel Kierkegaard's description of the absurdity of faith in the infinitely powerful God who has so much love for finite humans that he became a finite human in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not saying you have to take a leap of faith in Jesus Christ, but the leap of faith in the idea of an eternal, infinitely powerful God seems easier if you equate God with the gravitational singularity, and then you see the parallels between the theological idea of requiring a leap of faith to overcome the infinite regress of reasons that you would need to rationally prove God's existence, and the physicist's descriptions of this absurd idea of a gravitational singularity where all the laws of physics break down. Psychology of the absurd. The self is the central absurdity. So here's a quote from Carl Jung describing the archetypal self. The point to notice is how similar his descriptions of the self archetype are to a gravitational singularity. This something is so strange to us and yet so near, wholly ourselves and yet unknowable, a virtual center of so mysterious a constitution that it can claim anything, kinship with beasts and gods, with crystals and stars, without moving us to wonder, without even exciting our disapprobation. This something claims all that and more, and having nothing in our hands that could fairly be opposed to these claims, it is surely wiser to listen to this voice. I've called this center the self. Intellectually, the self is no more than a psychological concept, a construct that serves to express an unknowable essence which we cannot grasp as such, since by definition it transcends our powers of comprehension. It might equally well be called God within us. The beginnings of our whole psychic life seem to be inextricably rooted in this point, and all our highest and ultimate purposes seem to be striving towards it. This paradox is unavoidable as always when we try to define something that lies beyond the bourne of our understanding. Just notice how similar his description of the central self-archetype is to the physicist's descriptions of the gravitational singularity. The beginnings of space-time are rooted in that central point, the gravitational singularity, just like the beginnings of our psychic life are rooted to this virtual center. Similarly, all of space-time is destined to return to the gravitational singularity, either by expanding out to the horizon of the cosmos, which is infinitely hot, and therefore contains a singularity at each of its points, or in the center of any of the black holes strewn throughout the universe, or in the miniature black holes at every point of the quantum vacuum underlying every point of three-dimensional space. Space-time begins with a point of infinite density, and it inevitably returns to that point of infinite density. So the psychology of the absurd, belief in God or the self-archetype, mirrors the physics of the absurd belief in a gravitational singularity. This is just more and more evidence for the equation psyche equals singularity. Psyche equals singularity a Munchausen trilemma. Self is the central absurdity. So Kierkegaard said that to overcome the infinite regress of speculations trying to prove the existence of God, that we have to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd. So the infinite regress is just one of three obstacles to using reason to prove any fundamental first principle of any argument. And what I'll be arguing in these next few slides is that the psyche equals singularity equation is the psychological and physical correlate of the epistemological problem of the Munchausen trilemma. I know that sounds like a mouthful of complicated words, but it's going to make more sense as we progress through the next few slides. So the legendary Baron Munchausen pulled himself and the horse he was riding out of a mud pit by pulling up on his own ponytail. That physically impossible feat made Munchausen the namesake of a three-pronged thought experiment that points to an epistemological impossibility. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we acquire knowledge, how we learn. So all attempts to prove a truth claim, to establish a first principle on which to ground an argument, fail by going down one of three seemingly groundless avenues of explanation. 1, the infinite regress. 2, circular reasoning. 3, an assertion of self-evidence. We'll be going over each of these. Psyche equals singularity neutralizes the Munchausen trilemma because it is the psychological and cosmological correlate of that epistemological conundrum. The singularity is an infinite regress of space-time. The psyche is an infinite regress of consciousness. Space-time comes from and returns to the singularity. That seems to mirror circular reasoning. And the self-archetype is the gravitational singularity. So that seems reminiscent of an assertion of self-evidence. But I'll be going over each of these three aspects of the Munchausen trilemma in the next few slides. Psyche equals infinite regress. Here's another quote from Kierkegaard, or just restating a quote that we already read in a previous slide. I am charging the individual in question with not willing to stop the infinity of reflection. So that's a reference to the infinite regress. You need to take a leap of faith and just stop asking endlessly why. I am arguing that the psyche equals singularity, which is an infinite regress of spacetime. That equation helps us take the leap of faith because it neutralizes the demand for an infinity of reflection. It neutralizes it by paralleling it. It is one and the same thing with the epistemological problem of the infinite regress. The infinite regress occurs when every truth claim requires another supporting truth claim ad infinitum, the children's game of asking endlessly why. Why is it raining? Because the water fell from the clouds. Why did the water fall from the clouds? Because it was too heavy and the clouds couldn't hold it anymore, whatever the atmospheric reasons are. Why do clouds form? Well, why does that happen? Why does that happen? One thing that you can always do is say, because of the gravitational singularity at the Big Bang. That's the ultimate reason why, because that's the beginning of space-time itself. And if psyche equals singularity, it's the origin of consciousness itself. But continuing here in the slide, the singularity is an infinite regress of all space-time, an infinitely deep gravitational well that contains the entire timeline of the universe. The singularity as the psyche is also an infinite regress of consciousness and all of the philosophical questions it can ask. So one of the obstacles to believing in God is that there's always another question to be answered. That's the infinity of reflection to which Kierkegaard was referring. If psyche equals singularity, if God, the self-archetype, equals a gravitational singularity, then when your mind demands more and more reasons, you can say, well, look, we're going to satisfy your demand for an infinite regress of questions by saying that God is the infinite regress of questions. God is the infinite regress of everything. So it's not that we're going to ignore the demand for an infinity of answers. We're going to say that God is an infinity of answers. And the evidence presented in this class helps us believe that. There's, I believe, sufficient reason to put an end to the infinite demand for more and more reasons and allow us to take the leap of faith that Kierkegaard says we must take, and that Ernest Becker, distilling all of 20th century psychology back to the still towering Kierkegaard, in his own words, says that we must make if we are to be ultimately happy as human beings. We must take this leap of faith in the infinitely powerful God. Psyche equals circular reasoning. I am the Alpha and Omega. That's a quote from the second coming of Christ in the last book of the Bible, the Apocalypse. Circular reasoning occurs when two or more truth claims refer to each other as their supporting standard of truth. Why is A true? Because of B. Why is B true? Because of A. That's one of the three prongs of the Munchausen trilemma. The first is infinite regress, and then circular reasoning. If you're trying to prove the first principle of your argument, one of the things that people fall back on is this circular reasoning. The omnicentric singularity in every black hole and at each point of the quantum vacuum and the cosmic horizon gives birth to and swallows each point of every sequence of events in spacetime. It brings everything in the universe full circle, away from and back into itself. We've been discussing this. Everything comes from the singularity at the Big Bang. Everything returns to the singularity which exists at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. All singularities are identical, according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. They're all structurally identical, a mathematical point, and they all exist outside of space-time. That's where space-time stops, which is why it's such an absurd thing to believe in, says physicists like Michio Kaku. So, if everything necessarily evolves in a circle away from and back to the gravitational singularity, and not only do things end at the horizon of the cosmos, they can be pulled back to the original singularity inside any of the black holes strewn throughout space-time, or any of the miniature black holes that exist at each point of the quantum vacuum. The point is, the gravitational singularity is not only the archetype of the infinite regress, it's also the archetype of circular reasoning. With that in mind, I turn to the Apocalypse. Christ proclaims, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. The Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet in which the Bible, or the New Testament, was written, and Omega is the last letter of that alphabet. So the beginning and the end. That's what Christ says he is, or God claims to be. I'm claiming that God is the gravitational singularity, so that makes sense. God is the beginning and the end of all space-time. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna claims to be God, and he says, I am the Self, O Gudakesha, seated in the hearts of all creatures. I am the beginning, the middle, and the end of all beings. So again, we need to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd in an infinitely powerful God. That is the only way a human being can achieve full maturation as a human being. We will not be happy, we will be haunted by the fear of death, and we will feel unfulfilled unless we can perceive ourselves as immortal cosmic heroes serving a supremely powerful and eternal God. That's what Kierkegaard believes, that's what Ernest Becker says psychology has brought us back to. Whether God exists or not, we need to believe in God. The psyche equals singularity equation, I'm saying, enables someone living in the 21st century who's aware of enough science to be skeptical about any religious claims. This equation, psyche equals singularity, this fusion of Jungian psychology and Susskind's holographic string theory, I'm saying, is perfectly suited for people in our situation to enable us to make this leap of faith by virtue of the absurd. Psyche equals self-evidence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So the Munchausen trilemma, the 3 points of this trilemma, infinite regress, circular reasoning, and now an assertion of self-evidence. So famously, Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence for the United States says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the infinite regress requires an infinite series of reasons for why you believe something. Circular reasoning posits, for example, why do you believe in A? Because of B. Why is B true? Because of A. And then finally, people might say, well, why do you believe that truth claim? And then you could just say, it's self-evident. I don't have any other reason. It is its own reason. It's so obvious. The singularity is the infinite regress. It's the archetype of an infinite regress, I argued. It's the archetype of circular reasoning. I'm also arguing now that it's the archetype of self-evidence because I'm saying the singularity is the archetypal self. If, according to the psyche equals singularity equation, the singularity is the self-archetype that contains all of us subsidiary selves, then any evidence of its existence is evidence of the self in us all. In that respect, the singularity is literally self-evident. we are a self, we are the gravitational singularity. But continuing, as we shall see, the singularity also satisfies all of the criteria rationalist and empiricist philosophers like Descartes and Hume say that a self must have. Later in the class, we'll be going over the history of the concept of a self from Plato through philosophers like René Descartes and David Hume and Immanuel Kant up to Hegel. And the controversy over whether or not there is such a thing as a self comes down to whether or not there is something that is an unextended, indivisible, simple, meaning not composed of parts, eternal, omnipotent, omnipresent point that contains omnisciently each bit of information from the past, present, and future of all the universes which occur constantly and simultaneously within it. For there to be a self, Hume especially said, these are the criteria that must exist. This is conflating the criteria for just the existence of a self and for the existence of a supreme self, according to René Descartes. But, as we'll see, Hume says it can't be extended in space, can't be made of parts, it has to be some simple thing, and it must especially contain the past, present, and future within it. It can't change over time. That is what a gravitational singularity is. It's just uncanny how perfectly the gravitational singularity fulfills, especially David Hume's, but also René Descartes' definitions of a self. Also, before we leave this slide, this quote from Thomas Jefferson, this is the picture there, is from one of the walls of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., right on the river. I drive past it frequently. The idea of a self-evident truth, he relates directly to the idea of God. So I am arguing that God is the gravitational singularity, and that the gravitational singularity is the archetype of the infinite regress and circular reasoning and the assertion of self-evidence, which constitute the Munchausen trilemma, which is the rational obstacle to believing in any fundamental truth claim. Psyche equals singularity is the manifestation in the fields of psychology and cosmology of the same archetype that manifests in the field of epistemology as the Munchausen trilemma. Psyche equals singularity equals Munchausen trilemma. I argue that the psyche equals singularity equation is the manifestation of the God archetype manifesting in and uniting the opposite fields of psychology and physics. We saw Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli say that the laws of psychology and physics should mirror each other because mind and matter both emerge from the same self archetype. And I'm saying their prediction came true resoundingly when we compare Carl Jung's psychology to Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, especially Jung's near-death experience. So continuing with this slide, that same paradoxical archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites manifests in the field of epistemology as the Munchausen trilemma. Psyche equals singularity does not disprove the Munchausen trilemma. On the contrary, it reflects it, and by doing so, neutralizes its usual effect of inducing skepticism about absolute truth. The goal of this class is to help you make the leap of faith by virtue of the absurd in the idea that an infinitely powerful God loves and cares about you, a finite human being. The Munchausen trilemma is the famous obstacle to any rational proof for anything, especially for a proof of God. If psyche equals singularity is the psychological and cosmological correlate of the epistemological trilemma, that neutralizes that problem. Oh, I can't believe in God because it's irrational. There's really no reason to believe in anything. Oh, okay, well, you have a good point there, but by that same reasoning, there's no reason to believe in a gravitational singularity, and yet the evolution of mathematical physics stemming from Plato and culminating with holographic string theory indicates that there is a gravitational singularity, and notice how uncannily the idea of a gravitational singularity mirrors this whole problem of the Munchausen trilemma. It's as if really they're just reflections of the same thing. Oh, well, that gives me faith that it's not so unreasonable to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd in the idea of God, if God seems to be the incarnation of the biggest rational argument against believing in God. I don't know if that made a whole lot of sense, but at any rate, the point is that the mind-numbing equation psyche equals singularity seems to mirror the mind-numbing Munchausen trilemma, thereby ironically making both of them seem more believable. Munchausen trilemma, from obstacle to diving board. Susskind, while trying to disprove Jung and Pauli's theory of the universe designing God archetype, provided instead the holographic string theory that mirrors and thereby validates it. Similarly, the Munchausen trilemma provides the epistemological paradigm of the absolute standard of truth it was formulated to refute. This realization stills the troubled waters of rational doubt, allowing the would-be leaper to see that the universal mind is bottomless and therefore safe to leap into headfirst.
I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple-choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.